there was one issue Donald Trump talked about more than anything in his rise to the White House, it was this.
And make no mistake, we are beginning to build the wall, and we will keep out the gang members, criminals, drug and human traffickers that threaten our citizens and that threaten our security.
But what else would a wall along the U.S.-Mexico border keep out? It turns out lots of animals and plants that have evolved along the border for millennia. To these species, the divide between the two countries has never really existed. But a border wall will change that and possibly threaten their survival. Welcome to the Trump on Earth podcast. I'm Reed Frazier. There's a lot of controversy related to the wall's real and profound impacts on people, the private property of Americans along its route, and of course the billions of dollars it would cost to build. But the wall is also an environmental story, and it's potentially a really big one. This week, we're offering a bonus podcast about this issue. We have a story from our friends at Generation Anthropocene. That's a podcast that's based at Stanford University and features stories and conversations about planetary change, from the intertwined history of humans and ginkgo trees to the fight over a glass beach in California. It's really good. You guys should all check it out. This week, a story from that podcast. Maddy Belin is a student at Stanford, and she produced this piece.
When most people think of an undocumented immigrant, they tend to picture a person crossing the border, often in search of a better life for themselves and their families. To an ecologist, though, undocumented immigrants can look a little bit different.
So what we were focused on here are vertebrate animals that cannot fly, mammals, except for bats, and then we're talking about amphibians and reptiles.
This is Jesse Lasky, a biology professor at Penn State University. Jesse researches human impacts on biodiversity. Basically, how the stuff we build affects those mammals, amphibians, and reptiles. Back in 2011, he published a paper about what would happen to over 100 species if a border wall completely separated the U.S. and Mexico. In the wake of the 2016 presidential election, Jesse's once-buried paper has had a new life.
I've always kind of had it in my mind that this could come back, but it's maybe a little surprising that it's come back quite so strong. But I guess it shouldn't be based on the Trump campaign, because that was really a central promise that he made.
We will build the wall, yes. We will build the wall. Build the wall. Build the wall. We will.
We tend to think of the U.S.-Mexico border as being mostly dry desert. But there's actually a much wider range of climate and habitats. A coast-to-coast border wall would be almost 2,000 miles long, and it would cut through lush coastal grasslands, searing hot deserts, and staggering mountain peaks. Jesse's research suggests that a border wall would be especially damaging in regions that have high levels of biodiversity. A lot of species depend on cross-border migration, and his research shows that a wall would block species from their daily travel to find food. On top of that, it would divide each species population into two smaller ones, limiting their ability to interbreed and spread genetic diversity.
One major source of genetic diversity is dispersal from other populations. And if you stop that, then you likely get decreases in genetic diversity within populations. We're concerned that lower genetic diversity might be a problem for the potential adaptability of a species in response to environmental change, like something like climate change.
You might expect the species at the border to be mostly little lizards, but it turns out there's actually a much wider variety.
Some examples of that might be like the American black bear, which is pretty widespread in North America, but starts to sort of peter out as you get down to the U.S.-Mexico border.
Black bears are an important example because there just aren't that many of them this far south. Jaguars are also not very common around the border, as the border represents the northern edge of their range. Right now, there's only one jaguar living in the United States. People call him El Jefe. If a border wall were built, he would be left without access to his preferred hunting grounds, and he would be isolated from all the other jaguars in Mexico. El Jefe would essentially be the last of his kind. But even if species have a healthy population size on both sides of the border, restriction of cross-border movements would have serious consequences for day-to-day survival.
Something like a bighorn sheep, which is widespread in North America, but not so much in Mexico. And we have this desert bighorn sheep that lives in the Southwest. And these populations are fairly small and threatened. And, these things are grazing in a place that doesn't get a ton of rainfall. So, they often have to move large distances to find grazing places and also to find mates.
It's clear that building a wall along the border would be potentially catastrophic for species that live there. On the other hand, there's already a lot of development along the border that has had an environmental impact. For example, large sections of a border wall were built during George W. Bush's time in office. So what makes Trump's proposed wall so different?
So one thing to note is that the kind of project they're talking about now would essentially be an impenetrable wall. So, all those other things usually have some sort of openings and penetrability. But what they're talking about now is a solid concrete wall that's 30 feet tall or something like that. So that really stands out.
Dividing species by throwing a wall between them is already disruptive enough. But there's also climate change to factor in. Climate change poses a very real danger to all species, and that threat is amplified in the context of a border wall. As the planet warms, species may have to migrate northwards to live in the same temperatures they're used to.
And we do see lots of movement of the distributions of organisms in response to climate change. So this is something that's happening. If species weren't able to do that anywhere along the border, a lot of those things that would need to shift across the border to track their conditions might get squeezed there so that they would essentially have nowhere to go.
There are a lot of ways to study both climate change and negative human impacts on biodiversity. We asked Jesse why he even decided to look at this hypothetical future wall in the first place.
This is really a large-scale infrastructure project. Among the largest scales you can sort of think of. We don't often do in one fell swoop a project that covers, 4 states and all these very diverse ecosystems. So that was sort of the motivator there, which is, this big project was being plopped down across the continent without really the typical environmental review process.
Let's pause on that for a moment. There are a lot of laws in place that should protect our environment from huge infrastructure projects like this. There's the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the list goes on. But in 2005, Congress passed another law that can override all of these regulations. That law, called the Real ID Act, says that any major project pertaining to national security can ignore environmental regulations. So a 2,000-mile concrete wall, one of the biggest infrastructure projects you could possibly imagine, would not need to undergo any sort of environmental review process because it would be built under the auspices of national security. At the end of the day, though, it's impossible to know what the real effects of a border wall would be until after it actually gets built, if it gets built. There could be a lot of unforeseen consequences, so having at least one scientific study to examine the environmental issues is worthwhile.
And that's why we tried to do our work to at least put something there where we might have some sense of what might happen. But it's really dramatically an outlier in that sense of the scope of it and the lack of information.
This proposed U.S.-Mexico border wall is certainly not the only one out there. Border walls are becoming more and more common in a post-9/11 world, especially in Europe and other countries experiencing an influx in migrants. Millions of refugees flee their homes and need to cross borders to get to safety. Obviously, the concerns about any border wall go well beyond the environment. But it is worth pointing out that when humans build walls to keep each other out, we also block the movements and threaten the survival of hundreds of other species besides ourselves. These animals share our lands, but not our borders, and especially not our border walls.
That was Stanford student Maddy Belin with Jesse Lasky of Penn State. Since that story was produced, an environmental group, the Center for Biological Diversity, and a U.S. congressman have filed a lawsuit in federal court to block the wall on environmental grounds. The lawsuit claims the administration needs to conduct an environmental review before proceeding. Maddy's story aired on the podcast Generation Anthropocene in an episode titled Oh Right, the Animals. You can find Generation Anthropocene on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Stitcher, or online at genanthro.com. Like I said at the beginning of the show, it's a really good podcast. You guys should all go check it out. That's our show for the week. Trump on Earth is a co-production of the Allegheny Front. We're a public media outlet covering the environment in Pennsylvania. For more news on the environment, go to AlleghenyFront.org and Point Park University's Environmental Journalism program. More at pointpark.edu. Our producer and digital editor is Andy Cubis. Thanks to Point Park graduate student Rebecca Lessner for her help. I'm Reed Frazier. We'll see you next time.